The screen fades from black to a slow, deliberate pan across Flore's castle at dusk, the massive red sandstone facade glowing faintly beneath a bruised Scottish sky, rain streaking the leaded windows like tears that never quite fall. Inside one of the upper corridors, a single candle flickers on a silver sconce, casting long shadows across oak paneling scarred by centuries. A woman's silhouette, Mary Duchess of Roxburghe, stands motionless at the end of the hall, her breath curling in the cold air, while distant hammering echoes from below, workmen sealing off her wing, severing the last thread connecting her to the life she once commanded. The year is 1953. Britain still hums from the coronation pageantry, but here in this ancestral seat of the Scottish borders, the lights are going out one by one. Gas hisses into silence. The telephone line goes dead. Water pressure drops to a trickle. She waits wrapped in a cashmere shawl that once belonged to her Rothschild grandmother, listening to the house groan under the full weight of its own history. This is no fairy tale castle anymore. This is a siege, and the enemy wears the same ring she slipped on at Westminster Abbey 18 years earlier. If the image of a duchess barricaded inside her own home jewels, folded in yesterday's headlines, sends a chill through you, hit that like button now. It tells the algorithm this story deserves to be heard. And if you're drawn to the darker corners of old money, subscribe and turn on notifications. These stories rarely end with happily ever after. Flore's castle rises from the Tweed Valley like a dream built on contested ground. Its foundations were laid in the early 18th century by John Keir I, Duke of Roxburghe, but the land beneath it carries far older stains. The Kerr family border rivals by blood had clawed their way to prominence through raids, feuds, and cold-eyed ambition across the Scottish Middlemarch. To understand the house, you have to understand the men who built their name before it. The Revers were not simple bandits. They were a culture unto themselves, clans who operated in the lawless corridor between Scotland and England for nearly 3 centuries, where loyalty ran thicker than nationality, and survival demanded a particular kind of ruthlessness. They raided by moonlight, drove cattle across frozen rivers, burned the farms of rivals, and vanished into the hills before dawn. Entire communities lived under their shadow. Robert Keir of Cessford, later Earl of Roxburghe, rode out in the late 1500s at the head of men who left villages, stripped bare and livestock vanished by dawn. By 1597, English records credited him with 16 acts of lethal violence, part of a campaign that cost the marches tens of thousands of pounds and ruined livelihoods. He wasn't merely a raider. He was a strategist, loyal to King James VI, rewarded with titles when the crowns united in 1603. That elevation from feared river chieftain to titled nobleman was one of the most remarkable rehabilitations in Scottish history. The same instincts that made him dangerous on the border now made him indispensable at court. Power simply changed costume. The castle that once stood across the river, Roxburghe Castle, had witnessed its own grim chapter. In 1460, King James I stood too close to a siege cannon during the assault on the English-held fortress. The weapon gave way, shattering the king and ending his reign at 29. The blast echoed across the valley, a reminder that even crowns offered no protection from the ambitions they demanded. The Kerrs claimed the prestige of that ruined pile, renaming their new seat Floors. But the ground remembered. The original structure that rose at Floors in 1721 was the work of William Adam, Scotland's foremost architect of the age. A long, severe building that suited a family still half convinced that elegance was a form of weakness. It was William Playfair, a century later, who transformed it into the turreted, almost theatrical outline we recognize today, the battlements, the drum towers, the roofline, that against a pewter sky looks less like a home and more like a declaration. Every stone placed was a statement: we are here, we endure, we are not going anywhere. Fast forward to the late 19th century. The old river fire had long cooled into landed respectability, yet the estates demanded cash, The family could no longer generate on their own. The agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s had gutted the income of great British landowners. Rents collapsed. Farms stood idle. In London drawing rooms, the arithmetic was brutally simple. The titles remained, but the fortunes that once fed them had quietly drained away. The solution, embraced with surprising enthusiasm by the British aristocracy, arrived from across the Atlantic. Enter the American heiresses. The dollar princesses, as society called them, who crossed the ocean to rescue crumbling dukedoms with fortunes built in the New World. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 100 American women married into the British peerage, carrying an estimated $220 million in combined wealth into those ancient estates. They were not naive. Many came from families who understood leverage and negotiation. As well as any reaver chieftain, they simply wielded it with better table manners. What they received in return was a title, a history, and a place in a social order that American money alone could not purchase. What they gave was the infrastructure of survival. In 1903, Henry John Innes Keir, 8th the Duke of Roxburghe, married Mary Goelet, known as May at St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue, New York, in one of the most closely watched transatlantic unions of its era. The Goelet family fortune had been built on Manhattan real estate blocks of the city, locked in trust for generations, generating income as the skyline climbed. May arrived at floors with a dowry estimated at $20 million, the equivalent of roughly $650 million today, and she put every dollar to deliberate, purposeful work. May stripped away the heavy Victorian gloom. Dark mahogany gave way to light French furnishings. Modern plumbing replaced antiquated pipes, electric lights, and central heating breathed warmth back into rooms that had spent decades in shadow. The castle became a glittering showpiece, ballroom ceilings painted with cherub silk damask walls, crystal chandeliers catching every flicker of candlelight. She didn't merely renovate, she reimagined. Floors under May's direction became one of the finest private houses in Scotland, a place where the past was honored, but the present was genuinely livable. Guests who had visited the dark, drafty original and then returned after her renovations often described the transformation in near disbelief. This was what American capital, intelligently deployed, could accomplish in the hands of a woman who understood both beauty and management. Henry passed in 1932, at 56, leaving their son George IX the Duke to inherit a palace sustained entirely by American gold. George, born in 1913, had grown up between Scottish moors and London drawing rooms, Sandhurst polish, laid over Reaver steel. He was by all accounts a man of considerable charm and a certain cool remove, the kind of aristocrat who could make you feel both welcomed and observed simultaneously. In 1935, he married Lady Mary Crewe Milnes at Westminster Abbey, King George V and Queen Mary among the witnesses, the ceremony filmed for cinemas across the country. The union was extraordinary even by the elevated standards of the age. Lady Mary brought with her one of the most remarkable bloodlines in British life, the Rothschild banking dynasty on her mother's side, the Rosebery prime ministerial heritage through her father, and now the Roxburghe land and title through George. Three distinct pillars of British power, finance, politics, and land converged in a single marriage. It was the kind of alliance that made other aristocratic families pause and recalibrate. Tiara after tiara entered her collection, the Art Deco Cartier halo, with its detachable brooch, the winged Valkyrie Victorian wings remounted on a modern bandeau trembling on end tremblant springs, and the Rosebery ruby parure with untreated Burmese pigeons, bloodstones, acquired in 1880. For Hannah de Rothschild herself, power seemed unassailable. Wealth layered upon wealth, ambition rewarded across generations. Yet the shadows lengthened early. The Keirs had always lived by control. Raids demanded ruthless loyalty, titles demanded heirs. George inherited that instinct in full. And perhaps beneath the Sandhurst manners and the London club membership something else too. The border river's deep conviction that what he held was his alone to determine that consent was a courtesy extended only at his discretion. It would take years for that conviction to surface. That it did was by any measure one of the more remarkable domestic confrontations in post-war British aristocratic life. By the early 1950s, the marriage had curdled into silence and mutual suspicion. The war years had been difficult for many couples of their class, long separations, the redistribution of domestic staff to war industries, the general dismantling of the Edwardian world that made great houses function. Some marriages survived those pressures. Others merely deferred their fractures. The Roxburghe marriage, it seems, fell into the second category. No public reason ever surfaced for the final rupture, but whispers in London clubs and along Kelso's cobbled streets pointed consistently toward infidelity on his part. Whether the cause was one transgression or an accumulation of smaller ones, the outcome was the same. In 1953, as coronation bunting still hung in London streets, and the country congratulated itself on a new Elizabethan-age George moved against his wife with a precision that would have impressed his border reiver ancestors. Under Scottish common law at the time, a wife resided in the marital home only by her husband's consent. The law in this regard had changed remarkably little since the centuries when women were considered legal extensions of their husbands rather than independent persons. George knew the statute. He withdrew his consent. Workmen appeared at floors to seal her private wing, electricity disconnected, gas shut off, telephone silenced. Water supply teetered on the edge of being cut entirely. What made the strategy particularly calculated was its incremental nature, not a single dramatic confrontation, but a slow, methodical removal of comfort, warmth, and connection, a medieval siege updated for the post-war era. Mary refused to leave. That refusal was itself an act of considerable courage. She had no legal recourse under the existing framework. She had no children from the marriage, whose welfare might have provided leverage. She had essentially her own will and the quiet solidarity of her neighbors. Lord Hague among them slipped food candles and paraffin lamps through side doors under cover of night, small acts of defiance against a duke conducted in whispers and shadows not entirely unlike the old reiver networks of mutual protection that had sustained border communities centuries before. The Earl of Home, a future Prime Minister, offered a sharper tactic: notify the insurers that cutting the water supply would escalate the fire risk to a listed historic structure, voiding the policy outright. The threat held the taps on. It was the kind of solution that appealed to the British establishment mind, elegant, bloodless, effective, and carrying just enough legal ambiguity to make everyone slightly uncomfortable. For 6 weeks, the siege endured. 100 rooms once filled with the warmth of May Goes renovations now echoed with cold and silence. One woman paced those empty corridors framed on all sides by portraits of ancestors who had survived worse feuds that claimed lives in the Tweed Valley raids that reduced rivals' homes to ash. She would have known those histories. She had lived with those portraits for nearly 2 decades. Yet this particular betrayal cut differently. It came not from a rival clan or a hostile crown, but from the man whose name she carried, whose house she had helped to sustain. The house itself had become a weapon, its grand architecture repurposed as an instrument of erasure. The standoff ended out of court. Mary left Floors and never returned. In the haste of departure, she gathered her personal jewels with quiet deliberateness: the Cartier commissions, the Golet pearl suite, with its rare gray-brown naturals, the French crown jewels brooch acquired by Ogden Golet at the 1887 Royal Auction, a piece that had once belonged to the imperial treasury of France before revolutions scattered it across private hands. She wrapped them in the daily newspapers of that turbulent year, tucked them into oak chests and battered tin deed boxes, and deposited them in a London vault. There was something almost defiant in the simplicity of the packaging: no velvet, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of the value being preserved. Just newsprint and silence, and the understanding that these objects belonged to her story now, not to the house that had tried to consume her. The divorce came through in December 1953, granted on grounds of George's conduct at a Scarborough hotel over the Whitsun weekend. The legal language was clipped and clinical, as British legal language tends to be, but the social implications echoed considerably further. Weeks later, in January 1954, he married Margaret Elizabeth McConnell, known as Church, in a 9-minute civil ceremony at Caxton Hall. The quip circulated quietly through drawing rooms. "Where is the Duke? He's gone to church." It was the kind of line that masked something genuinely bitter with a veneer of wit, which was, of course, exactly the point. Mary never remarried. She retreated to West Horsley Place in Surrey, a 16th-century family home she inherited in 1967, and lived there with characteristic self-sufficiency, tending the gardens, managing the estate, receiving guests on her own terms. Those who knew her in those years described a woman of formidable intelligence and complete composure, entirely unburdened by bitterness. She had chosen it, seemed to carry the episode as history rather than injury. She lived until 2014, 99 years old, when the last chapter closed. George departed far sooner in 1974 at 61, succeeded by his son Guy, from the second marriage. The irony was not lost on those who had followed the story. The woman he had tried to remove outlasted him by 4 decades. The jewels stayed hidden for over half a century, frozen in time, inside those 1,953 newspaper pages, in a vault that the outside world had entirely forgotten. When Bamber Gascoigne, her grandnephew, finally opened it after her passing, what emerged was nothing short of a time capsule. Cartier cases still tooled with them in Celtic font, the leather barely faded. One tiara tucked almost carelessly in a dented tin box, as though its owner had been in no particular hurry to make it comfortable. The stones as vivid, the rubies as deep, the pearls as luminous as the day she last touched them. Time in that sealed vault had simply stopped. The 2015 auctions drew serious international attention. Tiaras realized over $2.5 million. The ruby parure approached $4.3 million. The proceeds were not kept. They were redirected, poured back into restoring West Horsley Place as a working arts venue, a space for music performance, and the kind of cultural life that Mary had quietly nurtured throughout her Surrey years. Her final act of custodianship delivered from beyond silence. It was in its way more eloquent than any statement she had ever made publicly about what she had endured. Flore's castle endures. Its gardens are manicured, its ballroom still catches the light under May's chandeliers, and its tours are polished and courteous. Guides speak of dukes and renovations, of royal visits and architectural splendor. They rarely speak of the weeks when those same lights went dark, when a duchess moved through cold corridors, waiting for her own home to render its verdict. Or the older shadows, the cannon blast that claimed a king across the river, the river raids that left entire communities stripped bare along the Tweed. The 11th Duke Charles, married in recent years, carries the name forward into an era that has little patience for the assumptions his ancestors took for granted. Whether the pattern truly breaks with his generation remains an open question. Power here was never graceful. It was seized, hoarded, then lost, sometimes gradually, sometimes in a single season. The Cares understood that from their very first raid. What they perhaps never fully grasped was that the things most worth keeping, dignity, memory, the quiet inheritance of a life lived without apology, cannot be seized at all. They can only be chosen carefully and carried out in newspaper wrapping through a side door into the cold. The jewels outlasted the betrayals. Wrapped in careful silence, they waited in the dark until someone else was ready to carry the light forward. What price did they truly pay to keep the name alive, and how long before the next shadow finds its way across those sandstone walls?